thank you. Because somewhere it's going to die. It says, a thing came up that said live stream. So, okay. All right, I hope we I'm going to just get into it. But first begin with Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and mercy on us. All right, today we are looking at the jurisdictional situation of Orthodoxy in America, but even more broadly, we're going to look at the way in which Orthodoxy came to America, established itself, grew, and where it's going now. It has a unique history. The way Orthodoxy presents itself in America is not the way it presented in the traditional old world countries and how it grew in those countries. The pattern that established itself in America ultimately also became a pattern for a few other locations, such as Australia and the other like New World or new settled territories. But there's a background to it. And certain problems that have emerged, but also great opportunities. So let's take a look at some of the historical background. This particular lesson today will be a little bit more focused on history and how the church operates. But there's a good bit of theology embedded in what we talk about because it's just the theology of church. What makes a church, how does it work, and what is its mission, if you will. So, all right, so a little bit of the historical background, and yes, we do have to go back to Ottoman rule. If you know any Orthodox who are cradle Orthodox, they have not forgotten the many hundreds of years under Ottoman rule. But it's also important because it helped to shape the way in which the jurisdictional situation in America came about. So, where did the ethno-national religious identities of these Orthodox churches that you see throughout the United States, the Russian Orthodox, the Bulgarian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Albanian Orthodox, the Ukrainian, etc., the Serbian Orthodox. How did that all happen in a way that came here in those particular formations and that you have several of them, you know, all in one city, all having those particular ethnic national names? If you know anything about the Ottoman Empire, it spread very extensively. It was huge. And many of the locations that it came to dominate were places where Orthodox Christians lived. Not very many were places where Western Christians lived. In fact, really, the only area that was free of Ottoman Turkish Islamic domination was Russia. But the other Orthodox territories, Serbia, Romania, Albania, Greece, Armenia, the Antiochian communities in Egypt, and the Coptics, for example, they all fell under the Ottoman rule. And there was a particular system used by the Ottoman Empire to govern these people. They did not require conversion. Those people who were people of the book, Jews or Christians, were allowed to remain, but in second-class citizen status. I'm not going to take time to talk about what that meant. It was oppressive, it was difficult, but we're going to look at what impact it had in terms of the church and ethnic community or national community identity. The Millet system really actually forced the Orthodox to operate under their ethnic and national identity. Why is that so? Because the caliph, the Ottoman ruler, the Sultan, appointed a ruler for the Christians, but he didn't appoint it for like all the Christians. He divided them into communities. This was the millet system. And their particular ruler was considered both the religious and the ethnic ruler. So you have something called ethnarch. Ethnarch is an ethnic and national ruler. Arch means to rule, okay? And in fact, the Sultan invested him with his power. So, and he had to report directly to the Sultan. So now you have the religious leader, the hierarch of the church, and he did this for the Greeks, he did it for the Serbians, they did it for the Armenians, and down the line, okay? But now you have this religious leader in the position of being the political leader and the liaison to the political ruler of his people. And he had to collect taxes and pay it to the Sultan. This all begins to complicate and in some way corrupt the way ruling occurs, hierarchical rule occurs within it. It's not natural to the Orthodox system. And it forced the various Orthodox communities into ethnically divided communities. But it wasn't really all bad because by doing that, the communities held tighter to each other and actually did not get absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. They did not assimilate and convert to Islam, despite, I said they were second-class citizens. Well, second-class citizens was very hard, and you could bypass the hardships by leaving your faith and converting to Islam. Why didn't they? Economically, it was much better in terms of social standing, in terms of legal status, because legally they had all kinds of repressions. Fines were higher, taxes were higher for the Christians, punishments were more severe. They stayed within their religious and ethnic identities because those two, if you weren't fully Christian, if you weren't necessarily committed Christian, you were going to be a committed Greek, and those who didn't find their ethnic identity to be so powerful found it in their Christianity. But when you marry them, you had actually a very powerful subunit within the Ottoman Empire. That eventually backfired on them because these units all sought their independence, and as the Ottoman Empire began to collapse, they fought back and established independence as states and also now as churches. None of them stayed solidly with the ancient Mother Church, but rather identified themselves as self-ruled, as independent, and that word we use is autocephalous. This all happened within the 19th century. Now, some of them, like Serbia, actually it was reviving an already ancient patriarchate that had completely fallen into subservience under the Ottoman rule, but then asserted itself after liberation from Ottoman rule. The Church of Greece actually didn't exist as a separate church from the ecumenical patriarch, the Patriarch of Constantinople, until it asserted itself. First in 1833, And if you notice, I say in parentheses here, recognized 1850, asserted itself in 1833, recognized 1850. That's when the ecumenical patriarch said, okay. So it takes time for the mother church, the church that it was formally under their rule, to recognize this shift. And you see this emerging in the 19th century. This is important because the 19th century is the great century of immigration, mostly toward the end of it, but the people that are coming are going to be coming, the Orthodox that are coming from places primarily that have asserted their independence along these ethnic national lines. I do want to mention there was a concern among Orthodox that this could actually fracture Orthodoxy. And in 1872, there was a heresy, this is where we get into theology, a heresy condemned called Philotism or ethnophilotism. And that is the organization of a local church along ethnic and national lines. Why is that a heresy? The teaching of the church, the canons of the church, the rules that we're all supposed to follow are that where the church is, it's one community. So the way it used to go ages ago, right? The church started, let's say in Jerusalem, and it moved into Ephesus. The church was not identified as Jerusalemites who are there and Ephesonians or whatever that are there, and maybe some from Rome come, and those. You didn't have separate groups for each of those. Everybody together were one community from various different backgrounds. And when it moved into Russia, it didn't split up according to the Greeks that lived in Russia or the Serbs that lived in Russia, or the other. It was the church in Russia, the Orthodox Church in Russia. And so the idea is that where the Orthodox Church goes, it's the Orthodox Church there. But with this assertion of ethno-national identity, you are beginning to see groups cropping up outside of the mother countries, but even sometimes inside the mother countries, saying, well, we don't speak that language. We're going to congregate according to our language, and we're going to be a different group under a patriarch that's somewhere else. And you see how this is going to have some sort of impact on America. All right, so there's the history that we have behind what's going on. How did Orthodoxy get here? In fact, there were two major pathways. We forget sometimes. It's a very big country, and there was a major pathway that came in through the west, the northwest, and that's how it actually started. The earliest settled Orthodox communities were in the far northwest territories, yes, Alaska, but another huge pathway was mostly East Coast, and that was immigration. In terms of volume, numbers, this was the decisive pathway. But we're going to take a look at each one a little bit. Oh, I got a little map here, so you can see how distant these two pathways were from one another. And I want to emphasize that they didn't actually even know about each other very much. Okay, so the Orthodox in the far northwest were not really aware of or able to communicate with the Orthodox that were coming in from the East Coast. And I guarantee you the ones in the East Coast did not know about Alaska and hardly knew about anything that was happening in California. But as you see, the first movement really happened in the far Northwest Territories in 1794. It was the path of mission. And we should never forget the sacrifice, the dedication of the first monks that brought Orthodoxy to America. In 1794, a missionary team of 8 monks, including very famous, beloved St. Herman of Alaska, I'll talk a little bit more about him, traveled 7,327 miles. It took them 293 days to arrive at Kodiak Island. That's because they didn't come from the monastery that's closest to Alaska. They actually crossed most of Russia, because this team of monks were on fire with mission in their hearts, okay? They wanted to bring the light of Christ to the New World. Those Alaskan territories were under Russian control at the time. They didn't belong to the United States. And we know that they met opposition. So what was happening that you even considered putting Russians there? Well, Russian merchants and traders had discovered the Alaskan territories, seal, furs, and all kinds of resources and whale oil, etc. So they were beginning to trade with the natives. They were beginning to intermarry with the natives. And so the monks had heard about these people who didn't know Christ, and the Russian merchants themselves wanted a presence of their church in Alaska. And so they were going to bring Orthodoxy to this territory, but they did meet some resistance. We know that some were martyred. In 1796, Juvenali of Alaska, so he is one of the saints. And so the senior monk in the group, Rasa, determined that in order to have the proper authority, he really needed to be invested as a bishop, because then you can do things like ordain priests and continue to build the church properly. And also the sea captains of the day were very arrogant. They were treating the monks very poorly. They were extremely cruel to the natives. And Iosif saw this, and he wanted to have some authoritative voice. So he and some of the monks traveled back to Russia. He was ordained bishop, and then they came to continue their mission, but they perished. They all perished, except for the few monks that had stayed behind. They perished in a storm. So one who stayed was a very beloved Saint Herman of Alaska, who became a spiritual guide and director to many, many. He ultimately set up isolated residence on Spruce Island and reposed there in 1837. And there's much to hear about him. Then, remarkable priest, a married priest with children, Father John Veniaminoff, comes to the territory, to Unalaska, Alaska, and he was a man on fire. He indeed traveled long miles under terrible conditions, horrid weather, in a little canoe, going to the different islands to baptize, to preach. And he studied the native Aleut language and wrote an alphabet for them and began to translate materials. This is important because it illustrates the Orthodox principle that the worship of the people should be in their native language. This is going to have impact generations later for Orthodoxy as it begins to preach it and bring the light to English-speaking American-born people. All right. What about Father John? Father John Veniaminoff, his wife perished, his wife died, and then he was actually tonsured as a monk. Ultimately, he became, and I have here in 1840, he was consecrated as bishop he wasn't actually ordained here in the States. He was ordained back in Russia, and then he came back again, back and forth. Because of course you need hierarchs to ordain you, and they didn't have any. So he had to go back to be ordained as bishop. And he took the name Innocent. And he is known to us today as Saint Innocent of Alaska. And ultimately, he does go back to Russia and is consecrated as Metropolitan of Moscow. I say that because that's essentially the same position as Patriarch of Moscow. But in that period of time, the Russian Orthodox Church had no patriarch. It had been terminated by the Tsar. But that's Russia's history. We're not dealing with it. So we have a lot of things happening. The first native priest is ordained, 1825, Jacob Netzvitov. And we have the growth of this mission. And remarkable things began to happen. 1843, the first Orthodox mission school for Eskimos. 1844, a seminary in Sitka, Alaska. That's before any of the other seminaries, I should say, on the East Coast. We have the cathedral being built in Sitka, consecration of St. Michael's. And that is a very old photograph of this church, this cathedral. We have the first Russian parish established in US territory. It wasn't yet part of the, it's still just territories. It isn't actually a state. California is not a state yet. In 1868. And in 1870, this outpost, if you will, was finally structured into a diocese. Now, just think about this, okay? They come here, there's no church, there's no schools, there's no way to educate your children, there's no structures, there's no diocese, there's no bishop. Everything's being built up on the West Coast here. And then on the East Coast, they're going to have to do that too. So we'll get to that in a minute. A lot of work, a lot of devotion. Here are some historical photographs of the work that was done. You have a native congregation on the Seal Island from 1905. And then a Russian priest with the chiefs and headmen of the Tlingits in Sitka, Alaska. This here is the St. Michael's Cathedral in its earlier and now its current, well, 2007 form. By the time Alaska went from territories into being American territories in 1867, being sold to America, this Russian mission had grown to 12,000 baptized Christians, 9 parishes, 35 chapels, 17 schools, and 4 orphanages. So it was really something. And here we have a few more pictures, an Orthodox wedding party in 1898. And this particular church is in the interior of Alaska from about 1851. This picture is about 1900, but it was first built in 1851. And now we're going to go all the way to the East Coast for the second path of Orthodoxy to America. The first path were bringing the faith to people who did not know Christ and required translating materials into a new language and learning a new language and dealing with a new culture and a new people. But the second pathway were Orthodox people who had all of that back home, coming to a place where nothing existed for them. But how were they to worship? How were they to express their faith? Between 1870 and 1910, more than 25 million, and yes, they weren't all Orthodox, but there were a number that were Orthodox, right? Arrived in the United States. And here's a picture at Ellis Island. I don't know about you guys, but my grandparents came to Ellis Island a little bit later in the 20th century, but it was a pathway for many Orthodox Christians. And the photo If you go back to the original map, and I'm not going to put the slide back, the entry points were New York, major entry point, sometimes Florida, but the third entry point was in fact New Orleans. And the first Eastern Christian church of immigrants that was built was Holy Trinity in New Orleans. And that's an ancient photo. Well, it's from about 1911. Well, it's an antique now because it's over 100 years. So now there's nothing here. There's no priest, there's no bishop, there's no churches, there's no schools, there's no choirs, there's no chanters, there's no books. And the people who came raised their own funds and built the structures or purchased the structures. They had to start somewhere, and they started from their own pockets and their own initiative and their own organization. The priests and the bishops came later. And that's another American reality that impacts the way the church is in America. A very active, dynamic, vocal lay presence. And of course, they purchase the lands, they purchase the churches, so they own the property. And sometimes that can lead to a sense of entitlement and power. And sometimes that meant that they treated their priests and even their bishops more like hired help. But that isn't the intent. The intent in the beginning were to really, and of course, this is the problem with human beings. We're all sinners, even the ones who are very active and faithful Christians. We all fail. And at times, we fail one another, we fail our church. But their dreams, their hopes, their intent was to build a place to worship and to raise the next generation to worship the Lord. They wrote home begging for clergy. They didn't know that there were any priests or bishops off in the Northwest territories. And besides, how could they help? They needed them right there where they had them, right? So who are they going to contact? They weren't going to contact Russia. Even though formally they might have jurisdiction, that isn't in anybody's mind. So they right back to where they came from. They ask their hierarchs from back home. And then they began to establish their own administrative structures, their parish boards and councils. They began Sunday schools. They began schools and choirs. They had programs to learn their own native language, Greek or Russian or Serbian, because again, they have several hundred years of memory that says you keep your language, you keep the faith. All right, you keep your language, you keep your faith. And here they're in this big foreign place with everybody speaking all these different languages, and they find identity, comfort, assistance, and they feel the proper planting of their faith by connecting their language with their faith. They established the women's groups, the philanthropic groups, youth groups, groups to help the new immigrants, and land for cemeteries. So, does this mean that nothing's happening in the Russian diocese as the immigrants are building things on the East Coast? No, the Russian diocese is growing, it's expanding. It's beginning to hear that it has Russian immigrants coming, but all these other immigrants coming. And so first the diocese moves from Alaska to San Francisco. This is the only diocese, by the way, operating at this time, the only Orthodox diocese. And they began to envision multi-ethnic parishes that really follow along the model of the proper ecclesiastical form. The true nature of the church is to be the church, including all the people in one place, right? That was their vision. And in fact, they made efforts to now fold into this originally Russian speaking, acting community, to fold into them all the other ethnic groups. They transfer the seat from San Francisco to New York. They elevate the hierarch from bishop to archbishop so he can start ordaining bishops. And they actually institute the first Congress, if you will, that includes lay people. It's different than back home. It's not like that in Russia. Why? Because this American experience is built on lay people being active and involved. And so they begin to include them in the decision-making of the church. All right. And so one of the principles of this Russian diocese that was building and growing was to, like I said, fold into them these other communities. One community was led by a man named Alexis Toth, who is now Saint Alexis Toth of Wrocław, because he was an Eastern Rite Catholic, and I'm actually not going to spend much time on him, but I will tell you this. The Eastern Rite Catholics maintained their Orthodox worship and doctrine, but were under the Pope. For political, sorry guys, that's my water bottle. That does remind me to take a sip. For political reasons and historic reasons, etc. But they were treated poorly here. And St. Alexis actually is responsible for bringing a huge community of over 20,000 Eastern Rite Catholics back into the Orthodox fold. But what I really want to highlight is how this growing Russian diocese is really trying to become an American diocese or an American Orthodox church by reaching out to people of all ethnic identities. And so one thing that was done was Father Raphael Havorini is consecrated as bishop in Brooklyn by the Russian Archbishop. He consecrated the Antiochian, Arab Christian Father Raphael to become, and he was the first actual bishop consecrated in the US. And he served the Syrian community. And he translated materials for them, and now he is recognized as a saint, Saint Raphael of Brooklyn. And he did a huge amount of stuff. He did so much. Parishes were founded by him and many other things, but we have more to cover, so I'm not going to get into many details. Serbians were brought under the Russian community first by recognizing Father Sebastian Davidovich, elevated to Archimandrite, in San Francisco and Jackson, California, to minister to the Serbian community, also today recognized as a saint. A person who really had the most remarkable vision for the Orthodox to be one church is Tikhon. He was Archbishop in 1905, and then he was actually called back to Russia, made Patriarch of Moscow. He was made Metropolitan of Moscow and became the first Patriarch of Russia after Tsarist rule came to a close. But of course, Tsarist rule came to a close with the Soviet Revolution. And so his term as Patriarch was mostly as a prisoner. And he did perish under the Soviets, and he is recognized as a saint. Enlightener of North America, but also as one who suffered under Soviet rule. And I say vision, I take from his own words. He says the diocese, now he's thinking of this, we call it the Russian diocese because it was still Russian, but he says it's not only multinational, it is composed of several Orthodox churches or communities which keep the unity of faith but preserve their peculiarities in canonical structure, liturgical rules, and parish life. These peculiarities are dear to them and can perfectly well be tolerated in the pan-Orthodox scene. We do not consider that we have the right to suppress the national character of the churches here. On the contrary, we try to preserve this character and we confer on them the latitude to be governed by leaders of their own nationality. He goes on to point out that life in the New World is different from that in the Old. A greater autonomy and possibly autocephaly should be granted to the church in America. 1905, he's thinking of an Orthodox church in America that is the Orthodox church in America. And within its fold, not stamping out the ethnic identities, but letting each community continue to express itself, but in harmony and cooperation instead of separation and competition. All right, but the second decade of the 20th century was a terrible time of turmoil, revolution, war, destruction, and it all ended up coming to the feet and sitting on the churches in America. And you find at the very beginning of that second decade, 1908, 1912, 1915, the anxiety of these communities about a Russian leadership, because situation in Russia was very dicey and very problematic. And so they are looking to their own hierarchs to say, we need hierarchs, we need organization, we need structure, we need governance. And the first thing that happens is the Greeks. Now, the Greeks had been under the Patriarch of Constantinople, but he was still under Ottoman rule. So in order to give them greater independence, he issued a tomos, it's like a decree that says, I'm putting you under the Church of Greece. So from 1908 until, I think it was 1918, the Greeks here were under the church in Greece. Because this is a Greek Orthodox parish and the Catechism class is here, I will talk a little bit more about the Greeks than about the other jurisdictions, just to let you know. You'll get a little bit more Greek history of the GOA, the Orthodox Archdiocese. But other groups were also working to do that. There were the Albanians in Boston, the Serbians were saying, you know, we want to be our own kind of jurisdiction, the Arabs, etc. Political turmoil. Well, what do we have? The Bolshevik Revolution. The church in Russia now cut off from its people here. They can't help anymore. The bishops here are on their own. How are you going to communicate? The money is dried up, the books, the instructions, etc. In 1918, there's lots of political stuff happening in Greece, not going to get into it, but in 1918, goes back from Greece to the Ecumenical Patriarch. We're still under the Ecumenical Patriarch, by the way. But nobody has actually seriously said, let's go back under Greece. And you know, he's the one in Constantinople, which is Istanbul. But my grandmother came from Constantinople. It was still called Constantinople, so I call it Constantinople. So anyway, with the series of cataclysmic events, the churches here each began to organize as really independent jurisdictions, including the Russians. But the Russians split. They split into 4 groups, but really only 2 that you need to know about. Rokor, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, and the Metropolia, it was called. Okay, so you see in 1921, the Rokor was founded. 22, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese is founded in 24. The Metropolia is founded. That Metropolia ultimately becomes the church we know as OCA. Okay, Rokor is still Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia is still under that title. The Serbian diocese is established in 26. Ukrainians, Romanians, they all follow. All right. One person I did want to highlight for you all, who became the first Serbian bishop here. He came in first he came in 18, but he came back in 1923 and he had been ordained bishop, and he began to found the first Serbian Orthodox diocese. His name is Saint Medadia, and I say he is our local saint. His relics are in Libertyville. 30 minutes up north, guys, and we can venerate his holy relics. And I highly recommend that you go visit and venerate his holy relics. And so he is in Libertyville, Illinois, and he is called Saint Medadia of Libertyville in Chicago. So we have a local saint. But that beautiful church is up in Libertyville, St. Sava, and it's also a monastery. And you have the consecration of the land in the one picture, and then the church. So I had the little detour for the Serbian. He is Serbian, but he is an Orthodox saint that we can learn a lot from and feel very close to. All right, so what is happening with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese? Now, I think it's a good time to pause, even though it's not 8 yet, because it's a lot of history that's gotten thrown at you. And what you have here is a sort of a shift to a more Greek Orthodox focus. And we will be moving into, we'll just start with a couple things in the early years, but we'll really spend our time thinking of 1920 and after. And then we will talk about what the church is like today and how we can be a church here in America and what our goals are to do that. But I would like to take our break now. I think it would be beneficial. So I'd like us to meet again at 8 o'clock. You know what, for 1 minute or 2 minutes before we break, are there questions? Are there questions? And let me pull up the Zoom people. Let's see. Okay. Any questions from my Zoom fellows? I'm sorry if I don't look at you very often because I'm usually looking at people who are here. But all right. Well, if you all have questions after our break, let's take at least 5 minutes and we will resume after 8 o'clock. Okay. Okay. Now, George, do I do anything? Okay. All right. Sure. You don't mind if I'm munching? I'm sorry. And it is that people will continue. Yeah. Very good. All right. Back. So, focusing a little bit here now on the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, but we will move into the 20th century where you will see all the Orthodox in various ways. But first, where did the Greeks come? How did they first get here? And the very, very first Greek immigrants arrived in 1767 in Florida as indentured servants. And actually many of them escaped. Some ended up in St. Augustine, many perished. However, about 100 years later, you see influx in the area of New Orleans and the first Greek Orthodox, but it was really understood as a multi-ethnic Orthodox parish was established, Holy Trinity. And we did see that photograph earlier in the presentation. The big mass immigration for the Greeks in particular was between 1890 and 1920. And you see major parishes established in New York and Chicago. The ones in New York and Chicago argue about who's first, but New Orleans still wins in terms of being able to say the first, and also in Lowell, Massachusetts. Initially, as we had said before, the Greeks were under the ecumenical patriarch. Then they went to the church in Greece. Then they came back to the ecumenical patriarch in 1922. And yeah, I'm not going to get into the politics of all of that. But the man who had been the archbishop here, Metaxakis, ended up becoming the ecumenical patriarch. And that happens again a little bit later on, where we have an archbishop, Athenagoras, very well known, very beloved, becomes the ecumenical patriarch, which really solidifies America with the ecumenical patriarch, right? And we become very much connected. and are his church, if you will. All right. There we go. So here we have the beginning of the growth of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. However, there was a turmoil in Greece between the ones called the Royalists or the Venizelos. That's two different groups, two different political parties, and you found this split happening among the Greeks. I bring this up as representative of what happened with every single Orthodox community here. Political problems back home, partly because they are still associating themselves with the ethnic national identity, not the American identity, okay? The things that are happening back home create for the Orthodox here mirror realities. And so you have a split back in Greece, you have a split here. Happened to the Serbians, happens to the Ukrainians, happens really pretty much down the line. One more thing happens that you probably have been like, what is this? A calendar changes. So in the West, the Gregorian calendar, which was put together under Pope Gregory, had been operating for several hundred years. But the East still operated according to the Julian calendar, also called the Old Calendar. It is not correct according to astronomical calculations and movements of the sun and the moon, etc. It's off by about 13 days. And in order to reconnect with science, but even more with the economic world and the political world that was operating now under a new calendar, many of the Orthodox communities shifted their calendar to something that they call a new calendar. I want to call it the Gregorian calendar because, you know, we don't want a Pope's name associated with it, but it's pretty much the same. But some church communities saw that as a theological issue. Not going to get into that discussion but it's a big discussion. But from the Orthodox perspective, the idea of it being a theological issue is a question of is the day that the time of year that we celebrate particular feasts, if you were to change that, how does that change it? How does it change the fasting schedule and other sorts of things? The Ecumenical Patriarch, the Church of Greece, and several of the other patriarchs moved to the new calendar. Some of the churches, even within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, refused to. They became the old calendarists. As you probably know, the Russian Orthodox kept to the old calendar, as do the Serbians. They never adopted the new calendar. What the Orthodox did as a compromise to recognize that we are still one church is that we still keep all the Orthodox keep the old calendar for Pascha and the feasts associated with Pascha. We call those the movable feasts. You might have learned that in class up to now. There's two kinds of feasts. The ones that are immovable. Christmas. It's always going to be December 25th. For the Greeks and the Antiochians and some of the churches, the immovable ones are the new calendar. What are the old calendar? The movable feast, Pascha. Why does it move? Because it's associated with the moon. And that moves. And What's connected to Pascha? Pentecost, Ascension, right? Because Ascension has to be 40 days after Pascha. It's not a specific, it's not like June 3rd every year or whatever. It's always 40 days after Pascha. Pentecost is always 50 days after Pascha. Those are the movable. Old calendar, movable old calendar. You might think this is an irrelevant point, or rather uninteresting or unimportant, but it is a huge issue for Orthodox, because we are all one family, and some of us are feasting while others are fasting. Some of us are celebrating and others are done celebrating for some of the feasts. It's still a big problem, especially felt here in America, because we have all the different Orthodox together, side by side. We still don't have unity in our calendar. All right, but there are historical reasons for this. In 1931, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop Athenagoras becomes the ecumenical patriarch. That's when he became Archbishop. He doesn't become patriarch until it's down here, 1949. All right. Now, as these different jurisdictions are growing, they're getting funding, they're getting hierarchs, they're building parishes. You find now consolidation and expansion. And among the most important things are the founding of the seminaries. Holy Cross is founded in 1937. That's the Greek Orthodox seminary. St. Vladimir's in 1938. That's the Russian one. In 1938 also, we find the founding of the Bulgarian Orthodox Mission Diocese, and we have other things. I could populate this slide with a lot more dates, but I wouldn't even remember them, so I don't expect you to. But a lot is happening. I have some photos of these places. Over here, we have St. Tikhon's Orthodox Seminary. That is also with the Russian Orthodox Church. St. Vladimir's in the center. And then our Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. This is the Church of the Holy Cross at Hellenic College, Holy Cross in Boston. But what is life here characterized by? And the word that the hierarchs used consistently in virtually every statement about the Orthodox in America and the way Americans came to understand themselves here is diaspora. Now, diaspora is a very ancient term that talks about the Jewish people when Israel was broken up and came under subjection. The peoples dispersed, so it reflects the dispersion of the people from the homeland. And how do you keep the people in this dispersion, in foreign lands, still connected to their spiritual home, their spiritual center? How do they worship? So, in the ancient mindset of the diaspora, the synagogue could never replace the temple, but it was a type of worship that enabled the community to continue and to thrive, always with, of course, the pullback to Jerusalem. Well, a similar kind of understanding is operating with this diaspora mindset for Orthodox, because if you think of yourself as an Orthodox diaspora, you're dispersed, your homeland isn't here, it's somewhere else. Okay, and your spiritual heart is somewhere else. And I remember growing up, I was born here in America. My parents were all born here in America. But I remember the hierarch in the area in which I was living saying to us children, we must go back to Greece to breathe the air of Greece, which is our home. And I'm like, I don't know. I celebrate the 4th of July. I don't celebrate. I mean, I do kind of celebrate March 25th, but you know, I celebrate the 4th of July. That's my Independence Day. But this mindset is very, very strong for Orthodox. It's still there. So, as somehow a geographic extension of the Mother Church. But I will say this, toward the end of the 20th century, some very visionary hierarchs began to say, are we still the diaspora? Aren't we somehow one Orthodox community? And don't we need to find a way to express that? And they begin to build, for the first time toward the end of the 20th century, they begin to build pan-Orthodox organizations, places where they get together, they work together, they think of themselves as one Orthodox community. This is another slide that just wants to highlight again the jurisdictional system. And one of the things that is closely connected with this idea of the diaspora is the sense that you do need to retain the language, you spend your efforts, your money, your resources on your community, your own ethnic national community. And if you think about what that means for outreach and mission, you can kind of see why, if you're stuck in diaspora, are you really being the church that Christ calls us to be? We'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. So side by side with the social assistance given to help newcomers, you see this intertwining of the ethnic and religious identity, and there are consequences to this. By the way, I should mention that you think all the immigration happened in the 20th century. It did not. It did not. We know that there were continual waves of immigration. For the Greeks, for example, in the 60s and early 70s, you see a new wave. In many ways, the church, the Greek Roman Church, was more American in the 40s and 50s than it became in the 70s and 80s. It became more Greek for a while because there were new Greeks. But then also think about the Middle East and those territories under tremendous turmoil and those refugees coming here. And they started all over again. Some of the consequences of this: resistance to movements for Orthodox unity, little concern for mission, little concern for outreach, strong attachment to the ethnic language for worship and education. I know for you people coming in as catechists, maybe you don't see these things as issues, but maybe you do. Certainly when I was growing up, I had friends who would say, and I had a dear friend who was very intrigued by the Orthodox Church, but she said, you know, I'll just never be Greek. I can't really see myself becoming a Greek Orthodox. I just will never be Greek. So, although you also have many converts who struggle very earnestly to learn the language, to adopt the customs. But is that the way to be an American Orthodox? Is that necessary? It's one thing to do it because you like it, you love your spanakopita. It's another thing to do it because you feel that you're not Orthodox enough if you don't speak Greek, or if you don't understand the history under Ottoman rule or whatever. What you start seeing towards the second half of the 20th century is an emergence of a consciousness that there is a way to be American and Orthodox. American and Orthodox. So we have the Greek Orthodox Archbishop Iacobos being enthroned, and he has a very sort of different vision of interacting with the community around us. You find the founding in 1960, this is a biggie, guys, of the Standing Conference of the Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas. It's called SCOBA. Why is it big? The first time Orthodox bishops of all the different jurisdictions get together and talk about major important things together. They early on, in 65, appealed to the mother churches to allow them to start taking steps to building an American Orthodox unity. Then we also begin to have lots more immigration, as I mentioned, between 1966 and 1980. A lot of different Orthodox communities experienced turmoil, and refugees flowed in, and other reasons. Economic hardship led to a lot of immigration. I want to point out the ways in which an emerging Orthodox identity as American began to express itself. And Archbishop Iacobos, very famously, on the cover of Life magazine, and my husband actually has that particular issue. I still have it in the house. Walked with Martin Luther King in Selma. You have the Orthodox Christians for Life that march. Orthodox Christians have entered the public square, have a voice. They want to be heard in America. And this is a picture of the very first Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in America, or SCOBA. And then something happened in 1970. An autocephalous Orthodox Church in America. Okay. Well, it was given its autocephaly from Russia. The Russians that came here and established the diocese and built the earliest communities and established this whole system of trying to incorporate other ethnic identities, and grew, and then got cut off from their mother church and had no hierarchy, governing them, reconciled with Moscow, in particular the group known as the Metropolia, I mentioned them before, reconciled with Moscow and asked Moscow as their mother church to grant them independence. And Moscow did. And so at that point, the only autocephalous Orthodox church physically in America was founded. And it took the name of Orthodox Church in America. Now, as I point out here, some of the Orthodox autocephalous churches, the Ecumenical Patriarch and some of the other ancient patriarchates, do not formally recognize that as canonically appropriate. I don't think we can talk about canons. If there's time later on, we can address this issue. But the question of canons has to do with who can grant autocephaly to a body, a community, who has the authority to do that, and how does it then get incorporated, this new community get incorporated into the wider fellowship of Orthodox autocephalous churches. But no one ever questioned that the OCA, the Orthodox Church in America, has the same doctrine and sacraments and worship And so we recognize those things, even though canonically we don't recognize them as officially autocephalous. It's a fine distinction, but it's how it's operating right now. As of yet, it's the only community to be granted autocephaly, and probably that's for the best, because as bad as the jurisdictional situation is, if we had like 6 autocephalous churches in one location, well, that's impossible. You can't do that. That is such a violation of what it means to be a church. A church is one unified community. We have expressions within it, but you can't have like independent churches. It's like congregationalism. That's a Protestant model. That's not an Orthodox model. Okay, it is not the way we operate as church. It's not the way we are as church in the world. So even having one autocephalous church only works if everybody's in it that's in that local region. So you can see why it's a problem. We're not really functioning the way a church should function according to the way we understand the church. But it's because of our historical realities, and tied with those historical realities are economic ones, resources, titles to land, authority, or if you want to say the word power. It's very hard to untangle those things, guys. So still, the Orthodox churches, we're moving towards unity. If we can't quite yet work as an ecclesiastical, administrative unity, where we are governed as a unified body, we can work together. And so we have now these important pan-Orthodox associations and organizations. OCF, for college students, the Orthodox Christian Fellowship. OCMC, the founding of the Orthodox Christian Mission Center in 1987. I have a little note here about the Evangelical Orthodox Church received into the Antiochian Archdiocese. And I did want to mention, the slide down a little bit. When I was fixing the slide, I didn't do it right. That 1987 should be another bullet point in front of Evangelical Orthodox Church, because there was a point in 1987 where a group of 2,000 evangelicals who never heard about the Orthodox Church, didn't honor Mary, they were completely off the charts, okay, decided they wanted to find the authentic church and began a process of searching for the authentic Orthodox Church, and ultimately came under the fold. They were baptized as a group, and they have done a tremendous job. Now they're fully integrated into the Orthodox Church, but they set up programs for scripture study. They were the initiative behind the Orthodox Christian Study Bible, and a lot of programs. It's a way, though, of thinking of the Orthodox Church as no longer ethnic, national communities. When you bring in all of these American-born, in no way ethnically tied to the old world, Orthodox Christians. You have the IOCC, founded, International Orthodox Christian Charities, phenomenal group. And by the way, they're doing a huge amount of work in Ukraine at this moment. But they also work within the US to provide for services and needs. In 2010, I'm going to skip 1994 for a minute. In 2010, SCOBA turns into something called the Episcopal Assembly of North and Central America, and now it is called the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, USA. This is the official pan-Orthodox group of all the bishops, and they are working now, finally, with the consent and authorization from the mother churches. They are working on envisioning Orthodox unity here. Ultimately, administrative unity. Eliminate the jurisdictional system. What's that little 1994 tucked in there? In 1994, in Antiochian Village, Ligonier, Pennsylvania, there was a meeting. Not just the top hierarchs, which is SCOBA, but all the bishops, Orthodox bishops in the US. And they issued statements calling for the beginning to move towards unity. And that was where they envisioned many of the Pan-Orthodox groups that we have today. I do want to mention that at first, the mother churches were angry and not supportive. But another 15 years passed, and then everybody was on the same page, which is where we're at now. Here's some of the work that is being done in Pan-Orthodox group, IOCC charities at home and abroad, the Orthodox Christian Mission Center. You see it here in Africa, but they also operate in South America and in Eastern Europe and in India and in Korea. What are some of these initiatives? The Orthodox Theological Society of America. And I'm a champion for them because I'm secretary. So, but they've been around for 5 years. Camper, Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. Our own Miranda Anderson is president this year. And Deacon Ted is going to be one of the plenary speakers at their next conference, which is going to be here at St. Peter and Paul in November. So it's great. Orthodox Christian Laity, OCL, there's a prison ministry, which many people in St. Peter and Paul are active because Deacon Ted is very active in that, our own deacon. An Orthodox Commission on Scouting, Orthodox Christian Education Commission, an Orthodox Christian Network. Zui for Life is an anti-abortion, pro-life movement and fellowship. There is an Orthodox Peace Fellowship, and of course there's Project Mexico and St. Innocent Orphanage in Mexico. And actually it's not in Mexico, it's if somebody knows where it's at, but in any case, anyway, that many of our own young people from St. Peter and Paul and parishes from the area here have assisted in building homes and caring for, providing for resources for these communities. And so I have pictures. One's from St. Peter and Paul in 2019. Camper met here. We also have Project Mexico that we were involved in, the Orthodox Christian Prison Ministry, and the Orthodox Theological Society was also, we met here, but this particular photo is from a different location. So what are our challenges here? This one. I'm going to take that first one there and I'm going to address it last. This isn't between Moscow and Constantinople. I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. But first, let's just say one of the things we have to think about is how we continue our relationship with our mother churches, because all of the ancient patriarchates, all of the hierarchs that we're officially under are in difficult situations for the most part, financially, politically. I mean, think about the Patriarch of Antioch. Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Ecumenical Patriarch. I'm going to get to the Moscow Patriarch in a minute, but at least consider what they went through under Soviet rule, under militant atheism designed to destroy them. Okay, that was their life through pretty much all of 20th century. Same with Serbia. Albania, the ancient patriarch, they were obliterated. They had to start up again from scratch. And so many of the others. The communities in the free lands, in the places where there were economic resources and a growing community, not one that's dying, but growing, were out in the diaspora, we're out in America. And so the mother churches need them. If we gain administrative autocephaly here, how are we going to continue to connect with them and support? Okay. There's a great concern for the preservation of the unique and special and beautiful ethnic expressions of the faith. The way the Orthodox sing the hymns changes from Greece to Serbia to Russia to Albania to America. The way we sing Christos Anesti changes. Christ is risen. It sounds different from one church to the other. They're all beautiful. Are we going to obliterate them and just have one? Or do you preserve it? But how do you do that and you still have unity? You have to think this through. Differences in calendar, as I mentioned, still a sore thumb, a sore point. Differences in how many we are in each group, how rich we are. We often say the Greeks are the elephant in the room because it's just a lot of us. And wealth. Well, wealth often is associated with power and control. So how do you get everybody together and work that out? And then let me address the big Trump problem. The schism between Moscow and Constantinople. So, given what has been happening recently, I'm sure most of you are aware that a few years back, in I think 1917, the Ecumenical Patriarch, after years of requests from the Ukrainian Orthodox in Ukraine, granted the Ukrainian Orthodox autocephaly. The Russian Patriarch refused to acknowledge that, claiming only they can grant autocephaly to Ukraine. And as the dust settled with the disagreement, the Moscow Patriarch chose to excommunicate the Ecumenical Patriarch, to break communion. To this day, the Ecumenical Patriarch says that we will not break communion with any of the Orthodox. That is not something he sees as worthy of doing that, but Moscow demanded that those who remain loyal to him, to them, also break communion with the Ecumenical Patriarch, and it has caused a serious rift, which has been extremely exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the support of Kirill, the Russian Patriarch, for this action. I'm not going to touch this right now, but safe to say that the Ecumenical Patriarch and also the Greek Orthodox Archbishop are firmly on the public record condemning the action of Putin and condemning the support that the Moscow Patriarch is giving to this invasion. So as you can imagine, the Orthodox world is suffering a tremendous upheaval. So what are the benefits of one autocephalous, unified Orthodox Church in America, one administrative body operating and governing? Well, there's a sharing or pooling of resources. You don't duplicate things, you actually share your resources. So you don't have necessarily competing programs, but a much better single program, especially in communities where you have struggling Orthodox churches with declining membership. The idea of combining them into one more thriving church that can provide multiple ministries and address the needs of the people more expansively is important. You can definitely speak more effectively in the public sphere with one voice. And I bring up as an example 9/11. I never forget, there was a national prayer service at the National Cathedral, and they had everybody up there. They did not have an Orthodox hierarch up there, even though the only place of worship that was destroyed in 9/11 was an Orthodox, a Greek Orthodox church, St. Nicholas. And the problem was that they couldn't invite everybody, and they really didn't know which one to invite. So they didn't invite anybody. Because the Orthodox, there's like, you know, how many different bishops, how many different hierarchs, and, you know, they didn't have room for everybody. So there was no single voice, if you will. When it comes to speaking about issues in the public sphere, a lot of times people are like, well, are you Orthodox? Why are you disagreeing with each other? Even today, you know, with what's going on in Ukraine, there are a lot of people are like, well, the Russian Orthodox Church is the Orthodox Church. And then other people are like, oh, that's not the Orthodox Church. You know, the Orthodox Church is much greater. What about all the rest of us? And so there's just all this confusion. So a lot of people just like, we won't deal with them. They are not effective. They have no voice. And this is an issue for us. As I said before, another reason for going for administrative unity is that's not the way, this is not the way we're supposed to be a church. It's not canonical. It's not true to our own identity. It's not true to the way we define church, the rules that we have that govern how you operate as a church. So we are breaking our own canons for hundreds of years. And mission. How can we invite people and convert them and bring them into our faith when there's a lot of confusion? And then finally, there's a sense that just as Saint Innocent of Alaska, St. John Vianney, who became Saint Innocent, translated the materials into Allen so that people could worship in their native language, we can be a church that worships in the language of our people, which for Orthodox born and raised in America, or converts coming in who are born and raised in America, is English. The vision is Orthodox and American. And I was trying to find pictures that show just a variety of types of faces. Some parishes are very diverse, and finding those parishes that post pictures is, you know, sometimes a challenge, but I have a couple that I thought could kind of help us to get the idea of Orthodox and American. And then our own Saints Peter and Paul, our Metropolitan Nathaniel, and you see Father Rick and Father Paul. But the real question that we have is, it's not just about being a structure or an administrative body or running ministries, okay? It's the real question is, are we building a community of faithful? what are we thinking about when we talk about what we hand over to the next generation? It's not just structures, it's a faith, it's a vision, it's communion with one another and with Christ. It is the gospel that we preach to the world. And honestly, I think the best image is the Paschal light, the light at Easter. That the whole point of the church here in America too is to bring the light of Christ to the world. To, yes, our children, the next generation, but, and then this picture actually is St. Hieronymus, which is in Niles, an aerial view. They do the Paschal lighting of the candle, the sharing of the light, the come receive the light outside. So people gather all the way around outside, and this is an aerial view of the light of Christ being shared, with the idea that it goes out into the world, right? It's not just here, it's out into the world, which is part of the whole process of becoming the Orthodox Church in America. So that's the PowerPoint. And at this point, it's, I think, our opportunity to ask questions, to share thoughts, or to ask about things that have challenged you along the way. I was asked a really challenging question during the break, but I'm going to ask if anybody else has other questions to address. So, and you know, and I was supposed to take. I was supposed to take. Sorry. Yes, we're finished except for questions. Okay, all right. You can go if you would like. Absolutely. I mean, you can go if you want, or we can wait. We can do questions. Well, I'm talking to. I mean, I'm happy to talk to them too, but there's only it's a very small gathering. Yeah. Well, if you look in Holy Scripture, there's no question that the position of Bishop of Episcopos is something that is very clearly present in the early Christian communities that Paul talks about. Bishop, yeah, Bishop Episcopos, overseer. You know, when you translate it into English, if you don't like the word bishop, the Greek word is episcopos, that's the word that's in there. That's what we call our episcopos. It means overseer, and to look over something. But if you don't like that word, you're going to put overseer. You're not going to use the word bishop. But that was clearly a position that was operative in the absolute earliest beginning of the life of the church, as was deacon. So then you think, well, what about priest? Priest is there, but it's into the word presbyteros, or presbyter, or elder. And you're like, well, why? Well, the Greek word for priest was associated with the pagan priesthood. And so it was not a word that they used to describe their own ministers of the sacraments for quite a while. So the primary position was bishop, and then the presbyters received their authority directly from the bishop, which is why still to this day, no priest can serve in an altar without something called the undimension, which is like a little, it's like a little signature that they put on a cloth that they unfold at the altar. It really means that it's like the bishop is here now, and the priest is the authorized, if you will, the authorized hand and voice, etc., of the bishop. But those are ancient and clearly present in the earliest layer of the life of the church. And if you look at other first century Christian materials, you'll see it there too. It's not like only scripture, although, you know, it's a big deal that it's in scripture, but it's elsewhere too. So to denounce that is coming at it with a different teaching that you want to like sort of impose on the material. It came out of, well, you know, Enlightenment thought and other kinds of, you know, because the first reformers actually didn't want to get rid of the episcopal system. They still kept an episcopal system. They just didn't want the papacy. So that's a whole other question, whether the papacy is ancient or not. And that is something, of course, the Orthodox would contest. We say the papacy, pardon me? I have not forgotten the deaconesses. The deaconesses are ancient and authorized and actually present in the same proto form that the deacons were in the New Testament. I do. I am part of that. Yes, I am. And Metropolitan Nathaniel knows it, so that's not a problem. But yeah, we are advocating for it because it is, it's actually valid. It was a real and ordained ministry. Women were ordained to the diaconate, not the priesthood, not as priests and bishops. We think deacons are stepping stones to the priesthood. They are not. It is a separate ministry. And we can, in fact, ordain women again. It's never actually been outlawed. It just stopped happening. Yeah. Okay. You know, I don't have a pen, but I should get your names. Just I should write this down. Hang on, let me get a pen. Right. Thank you, George. Because I should take attendance because Father George and Father Rick really likes that. Okay, Paul. See on the internet, Jessica. Vanessa. Athalia is not there, right? It's Vanessa and Dan. Who's there? Vanessa, who's with you there?
Gabriel is here.
Gabriel
is upstairs with the 4-year-old.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I'll put her down. There you are. Okay. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. Did I get your name? I don't think so. You are Paul? No. You did say your friend. I'm sorry.
Name?
Yeah, your name.
Necklace.
Necklace?
Necklace.
Maybe you're not.
Oh, was this supposed to be an assignment?
That's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm glad you're with us.
Oh.
I'm glad you're with us. Can I write your name down?
There needs to be.
No. That's all right. I'm glad you could join us.
Oh, thanks. Also, there was no disrespect
Guys, I'm chatting with a gentleman here, so we have some Zoom here. But if you guys want to go, or do you have questions?
Helen, two things. Thank you. You're wonderful. I love you. My brother Frank is watching on the live stream, Frank Castaneda.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he registered for the class, but he didn't have his laptop to Zoom in. So I wanted to make sure that his attendance is accounted for. He's been attending all of the sessions. And Helen, do you have a recommendation? I'm really fascinated by the calendars, the Gregorian and the Julian, and what you started talking about is really interesting. I was wondering if there was a book or something that lays this out a little more that you favor more than others. There's so much out there.
No, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that, Jessica. Nothing comes.
Okay. All right.
But I have your email, so I can easily get that.
I'll email you. Okay. Thank you,
Okay.
Helen.
All right, okay. So I'm sorry, did you? have a question?
The Patriarchate of Constantinople and Patriarchate of Moscow had formally in the previous past been unity with before the whole like 2000 where like the Ukrainian initially really blew up, and then in 2019